So as you can imagine, the Vietnam War was not a very popular war for a lot of people, or at least people that were outspoken. And there's various reasons why. First is going to be the issue of the draft. The draft is part of the issue with the draft is draftees were, 16% of the armed forces, which doesn't sound like a whole lot until you look at how they were used. The draftees were usually 88% of infantry riflemen in Vietnam, and these are usually your first ones in and where you see the highest casualties. So you have 16% of the armed forces are draftees, but they account for more than half of the men killed in Vietnam. So all of these unfair percentages, plus the fact that you could defer the draft, you could avoid being in the draft if you were in college or there were some other reasons that could lead to it. So of course, people that could afford to go to college or that they avoided it. So this is going to leave most of your draftees are going to be working class youths, and they're going to be minorities that can't afford to go to college or can't get into college, and they're going to make up the majority of these draftees and casualties. So you see why this is going to end up being a hot topic for a lot of Americans, especially college-age Americans. So in response to the draft and all the issues with the draft, you're going to have the anti-war movement. You're going to see a lot of protest. You're going to see a lot of calls for what we call draft evasion and resistance. So people not wanting to go into the draft. You're going to have people burning their draft cards, which at this time, if you are drafted and you avoid it or try to run away from it, you can be arrested and put in prison. So even today, guys, when you turn 18, you sign a draft card where if we have a conflict and we need to issue a draft, you're eligible to be drafted into the military to go fight. Another thing that's going to lead to the reactions to Vietnam and also the protest in Vietnam is going to be the role of the media. This is going to be the first war where you can sit in your living room and you can see eyewitness accounts, or you can see the action on TV from sitting in your living room. So the U.S. government keeps claiming and telling the Americans that we're winning the war. They use body counts to determine if we're winning, and they say, well, there's way more Viet Cong that are being killed than South Vietnamese and Americans, so we must be winning the war. But then people saw the news and saw the way the fighting was going, and so this created a credibility gap. So this gap of trust between Americans and the government. And so they start mistrusting the government and their reliability and giving the facts about the war. Something that Nixon appealed to during his presidency to try to counter the anti-war movement is what we call the silent majority. And these are going to be Americans that supported the war. He believed that there was still a great percentage of people that supported the war effort, but they're not the ones that are going out and being vocal about it and burning draft cards and protesting and having demonstrations on college campuses. They're going to be the ones that are going on in their everyday life, but they're not speaking up against the war or for the war. So he's going to really try to cater to that group and try to get that group to really speak up more. One of the positive results that comes out of the Vietnam War is going to be the 26th Amendment. The 26th Amendment lowers the right to vote to age 18. And the reason why this comes up is during the war, you could be drafted at 18 years old and go fight and die for your country, but you couldn't vote for who the president was that decided to issue a draft that got you drafted in the first place. So this contradiction led to action, which led to the 26th Amendment and lowering the voting age. So there's a positive result of the Vietnam War. A court case that comes out of the Vietnam War is Tinker versus Des Moines, and this is going to be an issue of looking at First Amendment rights. And this came from students who wore black armbands to silently protest the Vietnam War, and the Supreme Court ruled that you're violating a First Amendment right to assemble or to show your freedom of speech, and so they were then allowed to wear their armbands in school to protest the war. So this is just an example of the Supreme Court upholding First Amendment rights, and during wartime you can disagree with the war effort like these students did. Now let's look at the art and literature and music from the 1950s and 60s. Some of this was influenced by the Cold War. Some of it was influenced from in response to the 1950s idea of conformity and everybody being the same, and you're looked at suspiciously if you aren't the same. So let's start with the Beat generation. This is going to start in the 1950s, And it's going to be the start of rebelling against conformity, and we don't have to all be the same. And this is going to be more of a, it's going to start with a group of young writers in New York City. It's going to move to San Francisco. They're often seen as carefree, reckless, and they're going to, so you're going to see this sense of freedom and spirituality. And then this group is going to later be associated with what we call the counterculture. Counterculture is going to be seen a lot in the 1960s. And again, it's this idea of challenging mainstream thinking. So not being conformist and thinking outside the box. And this is also going to be where you're going to see a lot of opinions of anti-war protesters in this literature. A quote from a famous counterculture author, Norman Mailer, is, "Any war that requires the suspension of reason as a necessity for support is a bad war." So this comes out in one of his novels that he writes. And so again, this is an example of protesting the war through literature. Music's going to take a big change from the 1950s to the 1960s. Some of this is going to be challenging the silent majority, or the conservatives and the conformists in the 1950s. There's also going to be an invention that's going to lead to helping this, and that's the invention of the electric guitar and the amplifier. That's going to lead to your rock music. You're going to have music in the 1960s that's going to protest war in Vietnam. You're also going to have a rise in music from African American groups and the Motown movement. So you have, Elvis is a major character during this time, the Beatles, and then you have the Supremes, or the Motown groups, also during this time. Art is going to take a change from a more from abstract expressionism to more pop art, or what we call action painters. They're going to express their feelings through the rapid movement of color. This is a painting from Jackson Pollock. Another famous artist from this time is going to be Andy Warhol. And again, we're challenging conformity. We're challenging the silent majority with even our art. So let's look at how this era might be assessed. So again, we have a question with a quote. We look at who said it. We look if there's any years and what we know about those years. We know in 1967 we're involved in the Vietnam War. Okay, so we want to keep that in mind. So let's look at our question. The demonstration described in this article was most likely prompted by. So we want to know what caused the demonstration. So we're looking for a cause. Okay, so the demonstration that's talked about in this quote was what started it, what led to it. Okay, so the participants in this week's anti-draft demonstration, so there's our demonstration, it's an anti-draft demonstration, are students or young men who are working with a coalition which calls itself the Stop the Draft Week Committee. So we know during the Vietnam War that there was demonstrations against the draft. We've talked about all the different reasons why they did not favor the draft. So let's look at our answer choices that would maybe go with this. So F, renewed diplomatic relations with Communist China. If you've paid attention during our Cold War video, we did not talk about Communist China during this time period, during the 50s and 60s. So we're going to cross that out. G, escalated deployment of military forces to Vietnam. Well, this is during the Vietnam War, so this could be possible. H, the signing of Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This is not during the time period that we've been talking about, and this is not a demonstration against SALT. Also, J, the formation of NATO. NATO is in the 1940s. This is in the 1960s. That would be a bit of a gap for protesting, so we're going to cross that out. The only logical choice left over is this escalated deployment in Vietnam. Let's look at a question with a visual. So anytime you have a visual, you need to look at all of the pieces in it. Let's read our question. This is a cross-sectional diagram of a major operation ordered by President Harry S. Truman in 1948. So this describes what we're seeing in the picture. It was done in 1948, major operation by Truman. The flight pattern illustrated in the diagram was designed to allow an airplane to land every 3 minutes. So they're landing every 3 minutes. Why was this operation undertaken? What was the cause? If you notice, there's some trends here. What was the cause of this operation? So we see Berlin. We see 1948. We know 1948 is during the Cold War, and that's also After World War II. So we are flying over to Berlin and landing every 3 minutes in Berlin. Well, I remember in my history class that my teacher talking about we had to do this, what was called the Berlin airlift. And we had to take supplies to Berlin during this time. So why did we take supplies to Berlin? Let's look at and I know I took supplies to Berlin because there was a blockade by the Soviets around the city. All right, so thinking through that, let's now look at our answer choices and see what matches. A, to enable a rapid withdrawal of troops from a war-torn city. We're not withdrawing troops in this one, so we're going to cross that out. B, to deploy substantial invasion forces. Well, if you remember 1948, this is after World War II, we're not invading anywhere. C, to provide supplies to a blockaded city. Well, when I was thinking about through this earlier, I remember thinking of how this city was blockaded by the Soviets. D, to rescue thousands of stranded political refugees. And again, this is not the case in Berlin in 1948. What was going on was the Berlin airlift where they were providing supplies to a blockaded city.